Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. We're out here today in this new garden that I built completely from scratch last season. Now, it's still the middle of winter, it's still pretty cold out here, but it is starting to get close to spring, and that means it's time to start thinking about gardening. So in this video today, I'm just going to walk you through just the basics of what you need to be thinking about when you're thinking about planting a garden. Now, it is true that there's a lot to know about gardening. I mean, I've been gardening for more than 10 years, and there's a lot more that I don't know about gardening than that I do know. But it's also true that you don't need to know all of that to get started. All you need to know are a couple basic things, and the rest of it, you're going to learn by doing. So today in the garden, I'm just going to walk you through a couple things that I think are the most important to consider when you're thinking about starting a garden, especially if it's your first time starting a garden. So the first thing that you're going to want to think about when you're planting your garden is location. Now, plants for the most part have really simple needs. As I mentioned, there's a lot about gardening that you can get into. There's a lot of technical stuff that you can really get bogged down in. But for the most part, plants, their needs are pretty simple. And one of the most important things that they need is sunshine. So you're going to want to take a look around your yard. As you can see behind me, we've got a lot of trees here. This garden is really on the edge of the woods. In my yard, I honestly didn't have an ideal spot for a garden, so I just found the spot that seemed to work the best. The spot that has the most sunshine, and honestly, while my plants would do better with a little more sunshine, I'm really happy with the results that I get, even in this less than ideal condition. You're going to want to take into account what plants you're planning to grow. My focus is vegetable gardening. For the most part, vegetable plants prefer full sun. What that means is that they like to have at least 6 hours a day of full sun completely just beating on them. Now, that's going to vary a little bit depending on your location. If you're in like the hot sunny south, they can probably get by with a little bit less than they would need here in Connecticut. I'm in the north. Summers aren't quite as hot here. The sun isn't quite as strong here. So you're going to want to take into account your specific location, but the general rule is that most vegetable plants do want full sun. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, unless you're in a really hot climate, you're going to want to find a spot in your yard that gets the most sun possible. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're trying to find the sunniest spot in your yard is that the sunlight patterns are not going to be the same year-round. Here in Connecticut, right now it's winter, so we don't have as much sun, but the flip side of that is that our trees also have no leaves right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to visualize what my yard is going to be like in the summer when my vegetables are actually growing. We're going to have longer daylight hours. The sun is going to be more directly overhead. It's obviously going to be much hotter, but all these trees are also going to have leaves. So that's going to definitely cut into the amount of sun that the plants receive. Now, as I said, if you don't have the ideal situation, I certainly don't. Just go ahead and make it work, and you should still do pretty well. My plants don't actually get as much sun as they would like. I would definitely get more yield if I had a brighter, sunnier location, but I don't have the perfect location, and that's not going to stop me from getting what I can get out of this garden. So as we've already talked about, probably the biggest consideration when you're choosing a location is sunshine, but there's a couple other factors to consider too. One is going to be access to water. If you have your garden set up way across your yard, you have to walk hundreds of yards to get to it, and you don't have any irrigation system set up, it's going to be a pain in the summer when it's really hot. You're not going to want to lug water back and forth to that garden. So you want to set it up somewhere where you're going to have fairly easy access to water. You may want to consider running irrigation to the garden if you need to set it up somewhere a little bit farther from your house. But in a pinch, you can get by with watering your garden from the hose, only if you're close enough to a hose to allow that to be possible. So when choosing a location for your garden, you may also want to consider your soil. Is there anywhere in your yard that has higher quality soil, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, has really poor soil? Now, you can definitely work with soil to improve it. There's a lot that can be done to take poor soil and turn it into really rich soil, but it is a process. And so if you have a spot with really rich soil already, it's definitely something to consider, that you may want to consider that as a possible garden location. The final thing that I would really consider when it comes to choosing a garden location is aesthetics. Now, obviously, that's not really relevant to the needs of the plants, but it is relevant to your life as the gardener. The spot in my yard that gets the most sun is directly in the middle of my front yard. But my family, we're not really willing to sacrifice that space that we have there for the purpose of putting a garden right in the middle of the front yard. You know, it wouldn't really have the same aesthetic appeal, and we just like to have that lawn free for other things. My son likes to run around and play soccer outside, so that's kind of his spot for that. So you're going to want to take into account things like that as well. So once you've chosen your garden location, you've located a nice sunny spot that has easy access to water and really looks nice for how you envision your yard to look. The next step is to decide what type of garden you want to have. Now there are variations on all of these options, but for the most part there are three main options for types of garden. The first one is an in-ground garden. Now we're over here in my main garden. The garden that we were in before is kind of a newer garden addition. In my main garden, I do primarily in-ground gardening. Now you can see along the edge of the beds here, I do have some boards set up to just kind of delineate the edge of the beds. But as you can see, it's not really raised. It's raised because I've mounded up soil, but this is really just to delineate the garden beds from the pathways. So even though I have wooden edging around the individual garden beds here, this is still considered an in-ground garden. So there are some advantages to an in-ground garden and some reasons why that may be the choice that you decide to go with. One is that it is the cheapest. You know, you don't even need to have this wooden edging. We just put that in there basically because we wanted the garden to have a specific layout. We wanted to have the paths be clearly defined, and I wanted to be able to add compost and other soil amendments and have it still contained within the garden bed. Now, you don't even have to do that. You could do a traditional row garden where you just have a big plot of land and you just have walkways. I do recommend, this is my personal opinion and there may be many people who disagree with me, I do find in my personal experience that you get the most growing space and the most successful plants when you do have beds as opposed to rows. So in my garden, what that means is that I have these beds set aside. It's still in ground, it's still soil from the ground, but what happens is I don't step in those beds and I only walk in the path. The plants grow in those beds and I don't plant them in row spacing the way you see on the seed packet. I just pack as many plants into that bed as I can while still giving them enough space. I find that it allows you to grow more food in a smaller space. It allows the soil to maintain a better structure. And it just makes things a lot easier as a gardener because you have fewer pathways to manage as well. That is kind of off topic. I kind of rambled off into another topic, but I just wanted to include that little aside. For the purposes of this video, what we want to focus on is the benefits of in-ground gardening versus raised beds versus container gardening. So as I already mentioned, in-ground gardening is significantly cheaper because there isn't as much infrastructure that you need to create, that you need to build. Now, raised beds come with some cost, whether you build them yourself or whether you get them pre-made. They are going to be a little bit more expensive. You're also going to need to pay to fill those beds with soil. So because in-ground gardening doesn't require the beds and because it doesn't require as much soil being introduced into the garden, it's going to save you quite a bit of money. The other advantage to in-ground gardening is that it's really easy to have a larger space. You can fit, you're basically limited by how much ground you're willing to allocate to your garden and how much work you want to do. But really, as far as space constraints, in-ground gardening will give you the most bang for your buck. Now, when we were over in the garden addition, you saw that that is a raised bed garden. That is completely different from this garden here. Now, there are some advantages to a raised bed garden as well, and reasons why you might want to consider that as well. For the most part, a raised bed garden is generally easier to maintain. You know, you have clearly delineated pathways. Your beds are going to be raised a little bit, which makes it a little bit, depending on how high they are, it can make it easier to actually do garden work. It can make it easier to harvest. It can make it easier to weed. All of the work associated with gardening can be just a little bit easier with those raised beds. Additionally, because you're bringing in imported soil for the most part with raised beds, you can start off with better soil. You know, in an in-ground garden, you're going to most likely have to do some pretty significant soil building and amending to get your garden up to the type of soil that you want to have there. But with an in-ground garden, while of course you do have to pay for that soil, you can bring in basically perfect soil right from the beginning, and a lot of times that can get you off to an easier and quicker start. Additionally, raised bed gardens, you know, aesthetics is such a personal thing. It's really a matter of opinion, but it's a lot easier to keep them neater looking and organized. So if that is your personal style, if it's really important for you for things to be organized like that, then a raised bed garden might be something that might appeal to you. A lot of people also find weeding to be quite a bit easier in a raised bed garden. Now, once you have really enriched, well-worked soil in your in-ground garden, it can become fairly easy there as well. But it is generally still easier in a raised bed garden. The third option to consider when it comes to choosing a garden type is a container garden. Now, I realize that my container garden is not really all that aesthetically appealing at the moment. I mean, really, none of my gardens are. We are filming this video in late winter, and nothing in my garden is really alive or looking beautiful right now. So you're seeing my gardens definitely at their least appealing. But I wanted to film this video early in the season so that if you're planning to start a garden for the first time, this gives you an idea of your options. So you can see here that we're on my deck. I've got a variety of containers around me that I like to grow plants in. Now, I know I mentioned that these are 3 different options that you may want to consider for your garden. As you can see from my examples here, I did not choose. I decided to grow all 3 different ways. So as the season goes on, I'll definitely show you how all the plants grow differently in these different environments. But if you are limited to just one option, a container garden might be something that you may want to consider as well. Now, there are a few advantages to a container garden as opposed to an in-ground garden or a raised bed garden. One is that, you know, it's a little bit easier. You're kind of on a smaller scale here. I mean, maintaining something like this is a little bit less work than maintaining a big in-ground garden or even a raised bed garden. You're likely to have to deal with quite a few less weeds in a container garden. And probably the biggest and most obvious advantage to a container garden is that it takes up quite a bit less space. So if you have a really small space that you're working with, maybe you live in an apartment or you don't really have a yard, a container garden can be a great option to still grow some food in a limited space. Another advantage to a container garden is that it's not permanent. This is something that can be easily moved, and if you decide you want to change the layout of your garden, it's much easier to do with a container garden than it is to do with an in-ground garden or a raised bed garden. So those are some reasons why you may want to consider a container garden. So once you have your location and your garden type chosen, the next thing you're going to want to think about is your soil. Now, as I mentioned, at the most basic core, plants do have pretty simple needs. If we've provided them with sunlight by choosing a nice sunny location, we've provided them with water by making sure that the location that we've chosen has access to water so that you can water in between times when you don't get a lot of rain. The next thing that plants really need is nutrients. And the way that they're going to get the majority of those nutrients is through nice, rich soil. So most of us are not blessed with perfectly rich soil when we first start our garden. So that means that we need to choose some kind of soil amendments. We need to work hard to achieve that perfect soil. When I first started this garden, this soil was not rich and beautiful like what you see now. I had to work. It took me many years to get to the soil to this level, but that doesn't mean that you have to wait many years before you start getting a harvest. Now, obviously, if you're using a raised bed gardening system or a container gardening system, you can bring in some really high quality soil from the beginning. And if you've chosen the location in your yard that offers the best soil to start with, you're going to be starting from a better place. Now, to know what amendments to add to your soil, you have a couple options here. If you want to be scientific about this and you want to make sure that you are amending your soil, my husband is doing some work on the roof today, so please excuse any construction noise that you may hear in the background. And he's over near the chicken yard, so my rooster is not too sure about what he's up to. So if you hear my rooster, that's what he's up to too. So back to gardening. As we were talking about soil before we were interrupted by both construction noise and chicken noise, if you want to make sure that you are amending your soil, the perfect way, the best way to get the best results right away, a soil test is the way to go. There are a lot of different options. You know, a lot of local universities or extension centers will offer soil testing. There are also companies that you can send your soil out to be tested. You can even get those little home test kits. They don't tell you a lot of information, but they'll give you a little bit of basic information. Any of those can give you some helpful information. I will admit that I did not do any of those options. I just kind of started with my soil. I planted my plants. I observed my plants to see what they needed. So that's another option too. If you are like me and you'd rather just do it hands-on and maybe learn a little bit by trial and error, that's an option too. So one amendment that you really can't go wrong with is compost. Compost is probably the best thing that you can do for your soil. Compost has a lot of nutrients in it. It also has a lot of rich organic life. It'll add a lot to the microbiome of your soil. Now, we don't need to get all scientific about all of that. Basically, compost just really does help support healthy plants. So if you can find a really good source for rich organic compost and add that to your garden, I am not sure if it's possible to add too much compost to your garden. So I add several inches of compost to my garden every year, and that helps maintain this nice rich soil that I have worked for so long to build up. My plants really do appreciate it. So my personal strategy is just to add compost every year. And then I also consider what plants I'm growing. There are some plants that don't require a lot of nutrients and are fine just growing in my soil that I have here along with this compost. They don't need anything else. Then there are some plants, like for example, broccoli and other plants in that family are really heavy feeders. They really require a lot of nutrients. So once you know what you're growing, you can look into the nutrient requirements of each of those plants and see if you need to add any fertilizer. Now, again, this doesn't need to be complicated. You will probably still get a harvest if you just add some compost to your soil and you stick your plants in the soil. Just keep an eye on those plants. If they seem like they're not growing well, they seem like they're not growing fast, and they just seem kind of sickly, you might need to add some more fertilizer to your soil. But honestly, this is something that you don't need to go into it knowing it all. You can just learn through experience. That's honestly what I did. I just added some compost to my soil, and then I watched my plants as they grew. I could tell if they were successful or not, and if they weren't, then I could add something else to the soil. But if you want to know from the beginning what to add, a soil test is a great place to start. Now, also relating to soil and soil health, there are a lot of different gardening philosophies out there. I mean, you can see people that garden in probably as many ways as there are gardeners. I like to keep things fairly simple and fairly low maintenance in my garden. So what I do in my garden is I practice a basic no-till method. When we first started this in-ground garden here, I did dig up the beds the first time. I pulled out any large rocks, any roots, any weeds, anything like that I just removed from the soil. So we did disturb the soil that first time. So after that initial till, we really just add compost every year. I add fertilizer if needed, and I like to mulch the garden bed and let that break down throughout the season. All of that adds to the fertility of the soil. And by not tilling the soil, I'm not disturbing the earthworms. I'm not disturbing the beneficial microbes that live in the soil. By keeping the soil structure intact, that is, I find, I've personally been very successful by doing that. Now, there are many other gardening philosophies out there. As you start a garden, you may research some of those different philosophies and see if one of those works really well for you. What you may want to do is pick a couple that seem like they make sense, try them out, see which one fits your personal gardening style and which one you have the most success with, and you could choose one of those. But honestly, you don't need to have a gardening philosophy. You don't need to have a gardening style. If you just prepare your soil with some nice compost and you stick some plants in the ground, you'll learn the rest of it as you go. So once you have your garden space all planned, you know where you're going to locate your garden, you know what type of garden you're going to have, and you have some ideas for how you're going to amend your soil, you really do next want to consider specifically what you want to grow. Now, as I said, the focus of this video is really vegetables because I am primarily a vegetable gardener, but a lot of these same principles would apply to flowers or other ornamental gardening as well. Now, a couple weeks ago, I did film a video about seed shopping and how to choose what to grow, and I talked a lot more in depth on this topic in that video, so I will link that in the video description in case you want to explore this in a little more depth. But for the purposes of this video, just ask yourself a couple questions. What does your family like to eat? If you can grow something and replace something that you're already buying at the grocery store, you'll be replacing it with a healthier version, a better tasting version of what you're already buying, and hopefully saving yourself a little bit of money as well. Plus, you'll be gaining a lot of gardening skills. So that's a great place to start. Another thing is to figure out what grows really well locally for you. If you have some friends who garden, if you know people who garden in the same area as you, or you could join a local gardening group. I know Facebook has a lot of resources for things like that. You can talk to some people growing in your exact same growing conditions and get some great recommendations for what to grow in your area. So once you've chosen some plants that you really want to grow, you're going to want to look at the specific needs of those plants. You want to find out what season they grow best in your area. You know, some plants don't survive a frost. Tomatoes and peppers are some great examples of that. So in my area, those can only be grown in the summer. Basically between May and October, I can grow plants that don't survive a frost. Where if I'm growing something like broccoli or lettuce that can survive a light frost, I could grow that a little bit earlier or a little bit later in the season, while those don't do as well in the heat of summer. So once you know what plants you're growing, you're going to want to research the specific needs of those plants to know when to plant them. And also, in the case of some plants, you may need to add some supplemental fertilizer to your soil. As I mentioned, in my case, I usually add some fertilizer when I grow plants like broccoli because they do require quite a bit. So once you know what you're growing, then you can tailor your garden a little more specifically to those plants. So one other recommendation that I would make when it comes to starting your own garden, especially if you are a first-time gardener, is to start small. That's not always an easy recommendation to hear, especially if you're someone like me. I kind of get all in on things, and if I come up with a plan, if I say I'm going to start a garden, I immediately jump to I want to grow all the produce for the whole year. You know, that's pretty challenging to do as a first-time gardener. So what I would recommend is start small, because you're going to learn so much through hands-on doing. You'll find that if you really enjoy it, you'll be able to scale up pretty quickly. But what can happen if you start with a giant garden when you really don't have any experience gardening? It can really easily get overwhelming. It's really easy to get overwhelmed and for things to fail, to convince yourself that you're a bad gardener, for the garden to become a source of stress instead of a source of joy. And you don't want any of that to happen. You want to set yourself up for success. So you want to start off small. And as your skill in gardening grows, your garden can grow right along with it, and before you know it, you might be growing all your produce for the year. But it is really important to start off small. So for anyone who is new to gardening, whether you're a first-time gardener or you're just really getting started with gardening, I always recommend a great place to start is with culinary herbs. Culinary herbs are really easy to grow, especially if you grow plants like thyme, sage, oregano, chives. Those plants are really easy to grow. They're really rewarding to grow because they can really enhance your cooking and add some great flavor to your dishes. And they're also a great bang for your buck. They're going to save you a lot of money because any of those herbs, if you purchase at the grocery store, are really expensive. Now, depending on your area, what your growing conditions are like, those herbs may be perennial for you. All of the herbs that I mentioned are perennial in my area, which means that I can plant them and they'll come back for many years for me. That also makes them really rewarding to grow. So if you're not sure where to start, those are some great ones to start with. The final recommendation that I would have about starting a new garden is to just start gardening. It can be, as we kind of talked about before, it can be really easy. And I know this is my personality, so I'm talking to myself here. It can be really easy to just research something, to want to know everything about it so that you're prepared and that it's going to go perfectly smoothly the first time you do it. You know, honestly, it's probably not going to go perfectly smoothly the first time you do it, no matter how much research you've done. So while research is great, it's really helpful, it definitely does give you a great starting point. I find that, at least for me, the best way to learn about something like gardening is to just do it. And you know, honestly, there isn't that much to lose. If you garden and your plants don't do well, then you know what? There's next season and you can try again. You know, I can't tell you how many times I have had failures in the garden. Even now, I've been gardening for more than 10 years. I still have multiple failures in the garden every single year. But what you'll find is that as you grow in skills, you'll be more successful, your plants will grow better, and you're just going to find it a lot more rewarding. There are a lot of lessons in gardening that really are best learned just through experience. So I encourage you to just jump in, even if you feel like you have no idea what you're doing. By the end of your first season, you'll feel a lot more comfortable, and by your next season, you'll be a skilled gardener. So I encourage you to just jump in and give gardening a try. Just like anything new, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel intimidating, just because it's something new. But the more you do it, the more you'll learn and the more comfortable you'll get. So I just encourage you to plant and garden this season. If you're interested in seeing how my garden grows through the season, then I encourage you to come check back, and I will be posting updates as I start my seeds, as I plant my plants out, and as they grow, and hopefully some abundant harvests as well. I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.